Welcome, everyone, to Rethinking Agribusiness Investments Through the Pandemic, a series of 4 interesting platforms staged online for us by CASA, the Commercial Agriculture for Smallholders and Agribusiness Programme funded by UK Aid. CASA seeks to change how investors, donors, and governments view and invest in agribusinesses that work with smallholder supply chains. You can find out more at casaprogram.com. This is the third of 4 platforms and is focused on how to rebuild value chains with standards for food safety and against environmental degradation. This platform will explore the issues that gave rise to the current pandemic and investigate the potential implications for investments and food safety. For example, exploring the role of environmental sustainability standards for SMEs to reduce the risk of zoonotic disease transmission or pollution. We will explore how investors can be responsible corporate citizens, responding to global consumer appetite without sacrificing public goods related to health and the environment. Next week, we will consider future scenarios and investment opportunities. More about that at the end of today's platform. Before we get started, please allow me to mention some points about organization. Please leave your video off and remain muted. A recording will be shared afterwards. And for those that want even more activities, please follow the link in your invite or on the Hoover app to the excellent dossier of stimulating documents for this platform and for the previous platforms if you've not read them yet. Today's platform will last about an hour. We have 4 great speakers and some of your questions will also be discussed. So please put your questions in the Hoover app, as that is the best way to get a response from participants and to stimulate discussion during the 4-week series. Or you can send your question to our Zoom question master by double-clicking on him. And now let's welcome our first speaker. Dr. Nina Hissen is a livelihoods advisor for the Department for International Development. Nina currently works on agricultural policy, in particular on responsible investment in food value chains. Nina previously worked for the United Nations FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, and conducted research on water management, climate change, and migration. Nina holds a PhD on water management and climate change. Nina, you are most welcome. Please begin.
Hello, welcome everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. If not, please let me know. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak today and be even the first speaker of this really exciting seminar. So, as Julian already mentioned, the CASA program is a DFID funded program, and I will just be giving a quick input from the DFID perspective on food safety, COVID, and developing country contexts. So I would like to make 3 points. My first point will be that investing in food safety is really good value for money for ODA investments. And my second point will then lead to why DFID investments in food safety are addressing key challenges around stimulating needed investment in agricultural value chains generally. And the last point will then be to ask investors to do their part as well and not just donors. So on my first point, why is investing in food safety good value for money for ODA investments? So basically, we know that by investing in food safety, we can reduce preventable deaths. So every year, 500,000 people die of foodborne diseases. Foodborne diseases excuse me, reduce productivity. Current productivity losses are estimated at around 95.2 billion a year for lower and middle income countries. And by investing in better food safety, we can create better commercially viable livelihoods. So we think that food safety constraints at the moment are constraints for smallholder farmers to access higher value markets, and by helping them to do that, they can have a better income and livelihood. Of course, there's a link between safe food and nutrition. Food that's unsafe can also make malnutrition even worse because the body can't absorb the micronutrients as well. So really, for us in DFID, investing in food safety is de-risking our own investments in agriculture. Currently, DFID's commercial agriculture portfolio includes about 70 programs with a total value of £3.5 billion. So that's quite substantial. And of those 3.5 billion, about 1.2 billion are really committed to commercial agricultural activities. And I already said that we can observe that in order to help farmers commercialize, we think that the biggest opportunities are also in domestic markets to reach higher value markets such as supermarkets. And there we can observe that food safety standards are converging with supermarkets in export markets, for example. So really to have that opportunity, smaller farmers, SMEs, etc., need to raise their game on food safety standards. Quick word on the link between COVID and food safety here. We can already see from anecdotal evidence that the COVID crisis is raising consumer demand in developing countries for safer food. That has been previously a constraint. That was a reason why often markets were failing here. But because COVID itself is not a foodborne disease, there's a link obviously to zoonotic diseases, and people are more aware that food can make them ill. And for example, in Ethiopia, we know that people are now really demanding pasteurized milk over the traditional raw milk, for example. So that, for investors, they can certainly expect an increase in consumer pressure for safer foods, as well as also pressure from governments to act accordingly. So my second point is how different investments are already addressing food safety and how they can stimulate needed investment in agricultural value chains. So the CASA program that's hosting us today has published a very interesting survey of investors. You can find that one online. Investors found that one of the top 3 barriers for them to invest in SMEs, agri-SMEs and smallholder farmers were low productivity and low quality. And that ultimately means low compliance or poor compliance with food safety standards. So that's a key investment barrier. And also investors, we know that investors are predominantly interested in the value chains that are growing most quickly. And we know that with urbanization and growing incomes, there's more demand for high protein value chains such as meat, fish, poultry, dairy, as well as vegetables. But those are the products that are perishable and therefore pose the greatest food safety risk. And from examples, for example, in South Africa, we know that food safety really poses a big reputational and economic risk to businesses. So in a couple of years ago, there was the largest listeria outbreak in South Africa that could be traced back to a meat producer called Tiger Brand, which was the biggest meat producer in South Africa. And the outbreak killed 200 people. And the company lost 52% of its revenue, and their shares fell by 7.4% straight away. So that there is a really substantial economic risk to a company if you don't invest in food safety while you are investing in a high-risk value chain. So DFID is helping with its investments to level the playing field and to reform regulation. We're working with partner governments on this. And I already mentioned that we can observe a market failure in most LMICs on food safety. That is due to sometimes high costs, especially for small farms. They associate high cost with investing in food safety. Previously, consumer demand hasn't been as much in domestic markets, while at the same time consumers were demanding obviously safe foods for export markets. So small producers will sort of fall in the middle and wouldn't invest and then not be able to reach export markets. And there's certainly a lack of government capacity as well as capacity from the private sector to often enforce food safety standards. So different investments are addressing all of the above through the CASA program, as well as some of our future programs that are currently in planning. So I already mentioned that that DFID is looking to increase its food safety investments over the years to come, and we can also see that increase in awareness with other donors, and that also has something to do with only recently emerging evidence that actually food safety has a very big role to play in improving lives and livelihoods of people who work in food systems, as well as obviously the consumers. And I also think, or we think in DFID, that investors and the private sector will need to do their own part, especially around, if we look around commitments by the private sector to help reach SDG 2, zero hunger. Food safety is really one of the big gaps that are currently not addressed to reach that goal, because if food isn't safe, it's not food, and we can't reach food security either. So there's a really big gap in that we seek to close. The good news, let me just finish on a positive note, is that actually we already know a lot about how to make food safe, how a good food safety system looks like, what are the different controls we need to include in a system from a government perspective as well as from a private sector perspective. But the challenges are obviously around raising the finance for that, increasing investment in food safety systems in lower and middle income countries, including digital innovation, as well as tackling food safety issues in the informal sector. So really the challenges on implementation, but I think that challenge can be tackled. So thank you very much, and I pass over to Julian again.
Thank you very much, Nina. Thank you, and you've done very well. You've told us a lot in a short amount of time. There is a question coming in from the participants, and that's I'll put to you, please. And it is, how do we predict the key issues of food safety and environmental standards at this stage of the pandemic? It's still unraveling and revealing itself. So how do we predict what the key issues of food safety will be? And maybe there's nothing specific around COVID-19, it's just that it's raising the awareness. But anyway, what do you think about that, please?
I think actually it's funny, we were just discussing this morning. It's going to be highly context specific. So different countries will have different issues around food safety. What we can already see from examples from even more developed economies is that basically the COVID pandemic puts a lot of pressure on all of our systems, and that also includes food safety systems. So if you have a country where already there's a lack of capacity in tracking, controlling, monitoring food safety, you can expect that capacity to be much lower due to pressures that COVID places on the overall system. We know that, for example, hospitals will have fewer capacity to care for COVID patients, as well as patients who have an illness, foodborne disease. So that there will be issues around the health system as well. So while we can only estimate that obviously value chains that are high risk for food safety issues will stay high risk, and we can probably see an increase in most likely undetected foodborne
diseases
there, because they can't be tracked as well.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It would be great to hear you and our last speaker, who comes from Global Gap, talking a little bit later on maybe about the relevance of Global Gap and systems like that around standards to the issues around food safety. Anyway, maybe we'll come to that later on. Now we'll turn to our next speaker, please. Dr. Delia Randolph leads research on zoonoses and foodborne disease at the International Livestock Research Institute in Kenya, and the CGIAR research program on agriculture for human nutrition and health. She is Professor of Food Safety Systems at the Natural Resources Institute. Welcome to the panel, Delia. Please begin.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Sorry, just getting my video and microphone working. Yes, I'm here based in sunny Nairobi while working from home, where there could be worse places to work from. And for the past 14 years, much of my research agenda has been based here in Nairobi, based out of Nairobi, on food safety in informal markets, mainly in Africa, Asia and Southeast Asia. We've worked in more than 20 countries, from Senegal in the west to Indonesia in the east. And during that time, well, I should say that when I started nearly 16 years ago, food safety was not considered a very high priority, either for development agents or investors, especially domestic food safety. The focus then was very much trade, not aid. And the theory was that poorer countries should be able to trade their way out of poverty by producing, among other things, high quality agricultural products. And there has been a lot of investment in that and a lot of success. But what we have come to realize is, firstly, that a relatively small proportion of poor countries have the ability to become big players in export markets. And these markets are actually concentrating. We're seeing fewer players exporting more. And secondly, that it was not very difficult for them to produce safe food. They got help. The Global Gap and Eurogap and other initiatives were very useful. But meanwhile, the domestic markets, the markets where the poor bought and sold their food, were being ignored, both by donors and investors. And then just recently have we realized how big a part of the iceberg we had been missing. I think there were several things which led to this. The first was a report by the World Health Organization, which Nina alluded to, and that showed that the burden, the public health burden of foodborne disease was comparable to malaria, HIV/AIDS or TB. And yet the investments were orders of magnitude lower. Then the World Bank, I was one of the co-authors, also estimated that the costs in terms of domestic markets of food safety was around $100 billion a year. And the costs for food safety and trade was around $5 billion a year. So again, we were investing in areas which were not the most important. As well as that evidence from key IGOs, we have, of course, been seeing massive urbanization and changes in lifestyle. And with urbanization, people become, they tend to consume more risky food. We know that the most risky food is fresh animal source products and leafy greens, and people, as they urbanize and become wealthier, consume more of these, but also they tend to become much more concerned about their food. And there's been a whole series of scares over the last couple of decades, from melamine in baby milk in China to the listeria in South Africa, which again was referred to. But many of these other diseases, wet markets, SARS, COVID, avian influenza, and for the consumer, they often don't make a big distinction between zoonotic diseases and food safety diseases and just animal diseases. So for example, African swine fever, we're seeing a massive world outbreak, and it's causing consumers to stop eating pork, although it is not a zoonosis. In India, farmers are culling birds because consumers have dropped demand for birds because of COVID. And again, there is no risk, it's not a foodborne disease. But the consumer is king, and consumer concern is driving a shift in the way we look at food safety. And my last point about how we're now in a different world from when I started this research is this understanding of food safety trajectories, that things get worse before they get better. That really means that in the poorest countries, food security and short value chains and food security is a priority. In the richest countries, we do have good methods to manage food safety, albeit they fail from time to time, but it's the rapidly growing, rapidly developing countries which are also some of the most promising for investment, which are seeing the biggest problems, the fastest growth in problems, and the highest concern. So I'll just give you a couple of highlights from our research over the past decade and a half. The first is about, is the food in mass domestic markets unsafe? And certainly hazards are present. So whenever we look for a hazard, we find it, whether it's salmonella or arsenic or pig tapeworms. These foods contain very high levels of hazards. But we found that hazards do not always correspond to risk, and that sometimes risk mitigating practices can be very effective at reducing risk to human health, and yet regulations are still based on hazard, not on risk, which is very bad for smallholders because their food is deemed fatal to humans, and yet when everybody is boiling their milk, the fact that it contains brucella makes very little difference. We've also found that the formal sector is not always safe, nor the informal sector risky. And this was a surprise to many people because there was an assumption by politicians that if we formalise and modernise our food sectors, then they will make it safe. And then the other surprise to many politicians was that our food systems are anyway formalising and modernising, because isn't that what happened in America and Europe? But just recently, and the last AGRA report led by Tom Reardon, gives a very in-depth analysis of how what he calls the hidden middle, it used to be called the missing middle, but it's these small and middle enterprises that really are growing rapidly, intensifying, getting food from the smallholders who produce it, transporting it, processing it, retailing it, and getting it to the consumers. So this is really where the action is. When the formal sector grew, when supermarketization, that horrible word, took over in America in the last century, supermarkets were selling food cheaper to people with cars and with refrigerators. In most of Africa and Asia, supermarkets are selling to rich people. The fresh food certainly is more expensive, and the mass population doesn't have transport or food storage options at home, besides of which they like informal markets. They like the vibrancy, they like the relationship with sellers, they like the traditional food, and they like fresh local foods which they can buy. So we see that a lot of the future is going to be in this hidden middle, this 66% in the case of fresh foods, 80% of the market, which is small and middle enterprises. But just because they're small and middle enterprises doesn't mean that they're zero input or that they have no opportunity to change. In fact, there's a great deal of interest in increasing their productivity and increasing the better use of technologies, better use of financial services, and often, again, as opposed to the farmer selling at the farm gate who has got many more things on his mind than being a businessman. These people are entrepreneurs. They are open to opportunities if they can be presented attractively and make a business case. The challenge is reaching them, and the challenge is finding attractive products and which people are willing to invest in. So in short, our conclusion is that this is a very important area, both for food safety, also for livelihoods, also for gender. A majority of these SMEs are led by women, and in some cases, like butchers in Vietnam, they're more than 90% women. So there's lots of opportunities for economic development, equity, better and safer food. The question is, how do we harness it? And that's instead of leaving you with an answer, I left you with a question, but maybe we can come back to that later on. Thank you, Delia.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was great. And a reminder to all participants, please make your questions. If you can't do it through Hoover app, then please feel free to send a question to the question master on Zoom. I think it's marked as a Zoom question marker. Just double click on it and then send them a private message. And just also a reminder to everybody that CASA will soon be putting out a research brief on the underserved middle, just as Delia was talking about. Delia, I'd love to come back to you and get your view, because investors are listening and they're probably now thinking, wow, this is exciting. But then you said that it was a challenge. So what are the implications? What do investors need to do to best associate with that new area of the market? It's not the supermarkets, it's that the larger, less formal, still slightly informal. What do they need to do to get that right?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is communication. And again, challenges are being, we're also seeing opportunities. So traditionally, the main way was through developing associations, traders associations, sellers associations. And sometimes these have been very problematic, especially in low governance environments. But some of them have been very effective and are effective, and it depends quite a lot on the country. So where you have strong associations which are genuinely cooperatives, associations which are genuinely representing their members' interests, that can be an excellent way to access people. But I also think with internet now in Kenya, where I live, pretty much everyone has, who is running these enterprises has got at least a high school education. Many of them have smartphones, many of them are on the internet. So I think most of them are on WhatsApp. So I think there are emerging opportunities to reaching people directly, business to business, through modern ICT. And the third thing is, just quickly, never let a crisis go to waste. Now after COVID, I think people are going to be more than ever open to being approached and by people who are saying that they can de-risk and make safer their food. So this is now a strike while the iron is hot time. Over.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And now we turn to our next speaker. Ninka Stam heads the landscape finance team at IDH, the Sustainable Trade Initiative, mobilizing investment for sustainable land, water, and ecosystem management. She also supports sustainable land use investment funds, for example, And Green, Agri3, and the LDN Fund. Before joining IDH, Ninka worked with Triodos Facet, promoting investment in green and inclusive growth. Ninka, welcome to the panel. We're looking forward to your contribution.
Thanks very much, Julian, and thank you everybody for this opportunity to speak. Maybe just a quick introduction of IDH, Sustainable Trade Initiative, and the landscape finance team within that, for the audience that's not familiar with us. So IDH is an organization that promotes sustainability in global supply chains for impact on the UN SDGs and the Paris Agenda. We've existed for about 10 years. We have about 250 people in around 23 countries. And we work in agricultural commodities, 12 commodities like cocoa, coffee, fruits and vegetables, also increasingly in regionally traded food crops, for example, cassava. And we also have what we call a landscapes approach, where in a number of commodity producing regions where natural resources are under stress, we try to address those agendas through a more holistic approach than a single commodity lens. Maybe as a kickoff, of course, COVID-19 is really starting up a lot of change in thinking in the sector, and came to many organizations as a shock, with quite urgent response needs. So one of the first things that we facilitated or tried to support our partners with is, of course, in supporting them in addressing the most pressing health and economic issues that must be addressed. For example, through also a series of webinars on on-the-ground measures that companies in the sustainable land use space, like forestry and agricultural companies, can take, related to business continuity planning, operational health and safety, and also effective outreach to communities and smallholders within their remit. So a lot of those resources are actually available on our website, and I'll share them with the organizers of the webinars so that those can be spread further. And I think at the same time, like many others, we're trying to distill lessons, looking at COVID-19 trends. I think one of the important lessons or things that stand out that was also shared with us is increased demands for healthy foods. And I think that resonates well with this topic of the webinar today, looking at food safety. But also a lot of our attention is going towards COVID-19 economic recovery packages. And there we work very hard to keep a focus on the bigger picture outcomes of this crisis. And of course also the recovery packages that will come in. So a lot of money is being allocated for mitigating those economic impacts of COVID-19. And what we try to work hard on is that those economic injections will also help deliver long-term sustainability outcomes on climate, inclusion. So those really need to be incorporated into the response. Now, for the landscape finance team, our team 2020 was really going to be a big year, the super year for nature, with the CBD COP in China, also Glasgow coming up. But instead it became the year of COVID-19. And still it's important to realize that 23%, according to IPCC, of the total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions actually derive from agriculture and forestry and other land uses. So the agricultural sector also has an important role to play in combating climate change. But also we need to think beyond climate, because this is a holistic agenda. Deforestation and land degradation don't only impact climate, they impact loss of agricultural productive land. And that impacts food security, that impacts food safety, also with diseases spreading, it impacts livelihoods of people and their health. So this is really a very broad agenda, the agricultural development agenda and also the food safety agenda. It needs to be interpreted, in our view, as such. And with that, as IDH, we partner with a number of agricultural investment funds that really focus on sustainable land management and sustainable land use, introducing practices that can reverse the trend of land degradation and lead to sustained productivity, and with that also sustained ecosystem services. So here, for example, think about transitioning from a single commodity production scheme into agroforestry, agroecology or other sustainable agriculture techniques, many which have been proven, but in the previous paradigm that I think the previous speaker also alluded to, were not scaled up. So in terms of lessons on the food system and also our own lessons learned even before COVID-19 when driving sustainability through commodity certification, a number of thoughts or points to highlight. First, there was a big push in the say maybe 10 years ago to 5 years ago around certification and certification of commodities, also as a tool to drive farmer income and drive sustainability in producing regions. But if we look back, at least as IDH, but I think with a more broad community as well, certification has not delivered these type of impacts on farmer communities. Often those continue to live in poverty also due to volatile prices in the commodity sector. So look, for example, at farmers producing palm oil, coffee. Those prices have dropped in recent years and leave the farmers impoverished. So this doesn't contribute to a farmer resilience agenda. And another lesson learned around the food system, looking at the food system through a single commodity lens, is that through that single commodity lens, it's very difficult to address the underlying environmental and ecosystem challenges. So for example, it's hard to address deforestation in the palm oil sector if you only work with the companies and not with local communities. Policymakers, enforcement is needed, land rights are needed. And the same relates to food safety, for example, when addressing maximal residue levels. This can be done through a single commodity approach. It really requires working with farmers that also produce different things, working with the government to enforce for a wider production area to meet MRL levels that are allowed on the EU market. So that's the first important point. Instead of looking at the food system through a single commodity lens, really looking at a food system in its production base and looking at it through whatever is happening in that landscape if you want to address a broader agenda. So this new approach beyond the single commodity also requires investment models that are more inclusive and that don't really look at only the productivity of the investment into cocoa or any other agricultural investment, but looking at inclusivity looking at ensured continued production, so sustainable land use agenda, and looking at protection of the ecosystem, the climate, the water. And this holistic investment agenda in the agricultural sector really requires new collaborations. So for IDH, this thinking and this realization initiated our landscape approach. So this is the approach where we are now working in these agricultural hubs and producing regions, now working with local stakeholders to diversify agendas, improve land use planning through this approach of production, protection, inclusion. And related to that, also developing new standards, holistic new standards that look into these aspects and that mobilize buyers to source from regions that are on a path towards a sustainable production area and really making that transition. I think for this webinar, it may take a bit long to go into the details of how this approach works, but I will also share with the organizers some additional materials that can be looked at, referring to our verified sourcing areas approach. So this is really an innovative standardization or sourcing agenda through which more holistic sustainability challenges can be addressed than a single issue or a single commodity approach, which in our view could be quite an important solution towards making a transition towards a sustainable food system in the future. Maybe if I may, some other points to highlight are around the investment agenda. So really a lot more investment is needed, and I think that's relevant to speak to given the audience of this webinar. A lot of additional investment is needed to ensure long-term productivity of agricultural land. Productive land is increasingly becoming a scarce issue and a scarce resource in this world. And to address this, a lot of capital will be needed to scale up innovations and to restore productivity of degraded or existing agricultural lands. Also to make it possible to reduce the existing pressure on forests and clearing new forests and moving up the forest frontier for renewed access to fertile lands. And of course, there are many organizations that have lobbied and that have made it, that have shared with us evidence on how deforestation and progressing of the deforestation frontier can lead to new disease outbreaks. So building on that realization that this asset class really needs to be scaled up, investment into sustainable land management, IDH partners with a number of sustainable land use investment funds that Julian just highlighted. So these include the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund, which is a fund established under the auspices of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. There's also the Agri3 Fund, a new investment vehicle initiated by Rabobank and UN Environment that really wants to invest into a combination of rural livelihood improvements, halting deforestation, and sustainable agriculture and sustainable land management. And then there's also the Ant Green Fund, which is also an innovative investment vehicle that invests into agriculture, but requires companies to take responsibility for a wider landscape. So a landscape protection plan needs to be developed where the company shows how it contributes to halting deforestation, improved watershed management in partnership with local communities and government. So we all think that these are interesting new developments, but still it remains highly challenging to mobilize investment, but also for these funds to deploy. And speaking to the community that we're speaking to today, just to highlight, there is a need for these investments to engage on the sustainable land use agenda, and we need to learn, and we also need to learn quite fast if we want to meet our climate targets. So for the landscapes team within IDH, this means that we really focus on driving investment into sustainable land management for restoration, for reducing deforestation and land degradation, with the ultimate aim of transformative change in the food system. Just like this has happened in the energy sector, investment into sustainable land management through this holistic approach could become a new asset class. And there is a need for standards and for data that can link investors to the climate agenda and to making sure that their investment capital really contributes to the transformation of the food and agricultural commodity sector. And there are actually new standards that are being developed, like the EU taxonomy. So also for those that are not familiar with the EU taxonomy, this could be also something very interesting to look at.
Thank you very much. You've inspired us to look further and look higher and to do better. Thank you very much indeed. Now, there may be some investors who are listening who are thinking, wow, I'd like to do that, but I normally do something that is a little bit simpler. As you say, single commodity versus complex landscape. How do investors generally respond to that change process? Just in brief, please, because we need to save time for our last speaker. How do investors move from that simple approach to a more complicated approach?
Yeah, there are innovative business models that are being developed. So investors, instead of looking at revenues from a single commodity, can take into account various revenue streams. So for example, when moving from a coffee investment into an agroforestry land use investment setup, additional revenue streams could come from timber, could come from plantain and other undergrowth that is being planted before the canopy closes, and also looking at revenue streams related to carbon benefits. So there are really innovative business models out there. And I think the second thing that investors are developing increasingly is more technical knowledge. So just like we've seen in the energy transition, when financing big renewable energy projects, investors needed to understand the technical risks associated to those investments. And the same is happening in agricultural sectors today. Investors are increasingly investing in better understanding climate-related challenges and better understanding climate adaptation strategies that are needed to sustain the revenues that come out of agricultural investments.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. So our final speaker today is Anneke Vos, who is the team leader of the capacity building team at Global Gap, organizing workshops on the Global Gap standard. Anneke's team also manages the Farm Assurer Consultants program. Anneke previously worked in a Pan-Africa cotton project and as a sustainable agriculture manager for Bayer Crop Science. Anneke, welcome to the panel. Please begin.
Hello, thank you very much. And thank you for my previous speeches for the interesting points that you raised. Actually, very interestingly, I mean, I heard that some of you already are familiar with Global Gap, but you might not know that Global Gap was actually born out of a food safety crisis, namely in the beginning of the 90s, the mad cow disease in England. So back then, it was a huge problem, especially for the UK supermarkets, that they didn't really know about the beef supply chain and couldn't really kind of condemn that crisis now. So then especially UK, but also German and in general European retailers, they came together and said, okay, we had now this very high risk in the beef supply chain. And we also don't really know that much about our fresh fruit and vegetable supply chain. So we have like a very major risk there that something similar to what we had with beef might happen again in fresh fruit and vegetables. And that's actually how Global Gap was born. It was born out of an initiative from different market actors to say we need to have a unique system that makes us that we can reduce risks in the supply chain. So that's back then in 1996, Europe Gap was born, and then nowadays we are Global Gap to manage risks in the supply chain. Just briefly on Global Gap, we have today more than 200,000 producers certified with our standard, which is the Integrated Farm Assurance Standard, in over 135 countries. So the largest there is in Europe with 58%, followed by 19% in Africa, Latin America with 11%, and in Asia with about 8% of certificates. So even though we are a European organization, we're going more and more outside of Europe, because also what one of my previous speeches said, it's not just the right of developed consumers or consumers in developed countries to eat safe food. It should be the right for everyone, because safe food is food. No, like if you eat unsafe food, that won't really help you. So that's why I believe that every generation has the right to safe food, and by developing and implementing farm assurance systems that are based on facts and recognized across the supply chain, we support farmers in connecting them with the markets where they can sell their safely and sustainably produced agriculture products. And this was now a quote from our company's purpose, actually. Yeah. So I'd like to tell you a little bit more what does it actually mean to be Global Gap certified? And for this, I'm going to be the only one who's going to use a slide, but I just hope that this will help a little bit. So I think Alvaro will now show that slide. I hope it works. Just for your information as well, with Global Gap, we don't. So we're not like, as Nienke was just saying, no, there's a lot of standards of certified products. We don't certify a product. We certify the process of becoming a product. No, so that's very important for us. It's very a risk-based approach. No, we also talked about that at the moment from one of my previous speeches. It's not about hazard. We are risk-based. No, and what you can see here now on the slide is that we have, if you are Global Gap certified, you need to comply with 222 control points and compliance criteria. And there's a little bit of a difference between some are major must, minor must. I'm not going to go into detail, but in general, you either comply or you don't comply. No, it's very much black and white. What you can see here is that about 34% of our control points, they talk about traceability and management systems. There's a lot about documentation behind. No? So that was one of the biggest concerns back then when we were created, to have a better control of your risks in the supply chain. That's why you need to have documentation. And then obviously food safety is the second biggest point, where it's a lot about pesticide usage. How do the people use the pesticides? Where are they stored? Are the people trying to use it? And so on and so forth. Thanks, Alvaro. You can go back to the normal screen. Since I have already talked about risk assessment, what we ask all our farmers to do is perform a risk assessment on several topics, such as water quality, hygiene, health and safety of your workers, because every farm is different. Every farming system is different. Even your neighbor can farm differently and might have different risks because he's close to a water pond, because he does, I don't know, strawberries instead of pears. You know, we really try to take that into consideration. And also, we try to take that into consideration when we say, okay, you've got the big, I don't know, potato farmer in Germany that might just have a lot different risks than a small potato farmer in Kenya. And yet both of these farmers can become Global Gap certified. That's not an issue. And what we've seen in most of projects that we've done with IFC, GIZ, USAID, so with development aid organizations, is that mostly the on-farm practices are not the problem for the farmers, but it's the documentation that really is problematic. Now, it might just be the very first time that you document, and yet documentation is so important for traceability, to know exactly, you know, what has been going wrong maybe in your farming system, but also for investments. Now, investors like to know, what have you done in your previous years? What are you doing on the farm? Where are maybe my risks? That's why documentation is really key, and that's where most of the farmers, they're very new to our system, struggle with. And since I'm talking now about risk management, investability of customers, and also traceability, let me talk also about our database. And I heard in our previous calls, no, data is key, and especially now today's society. So each and every of our 200,000 farmers who are certified with us, they get a 13-digit GTN number, no, a unique identifying number that uniquely identifies the farm that they produced on, no, and that they're certified with. And with this information and with this number comes information to us at the moment. No? So that is, we capture information about the number, the surface that they have certified. They never have to certify the whole surface, about their location, about which certification body went to see them, about the audit date, when it has to be the next audit, and so on and so forth. And we have a quite rich database, as you can see. And some of the certified producers that we have in there, they've been with us for a long, long time, which means that in most cases, they have a long-standing customer relationship with their customers, because none of our farmers do it because they like to do it. It's quite cumbersome and costs them money, but it is because there's an export market demanding it, and that's why they're becoming Global Gap certified, and even more and more outside of Europe. And so there, I think for investments or investing entities here, maybe also participating, it might be quite interesting to have a further look into this database. Obviously, just saying we won't just give it to you like that. There's also some privacy we're taking very, very seriously, you know. So this is something very seriously we're taking care of. Last point, more or less, about the system, as I like to say, is contrary to other standards, we don't certify ourselves. We work together with more than 160 approved certification bodies, some of the bigger ones, some really local, smaller ones. And we were one of the first ones to have our own integrity system. So we check the work of the certification bodies again. And we do all of this whole elaborated system. There's more to it, which I'm not having time to explain, because in the end, it's important that we've created and we keep having a trusted system that's trusted by the retailers, by the market side, to minimize their food safety risk and their risk in the supply chain. Now, we've got more than 60 retailer and food service members, such as Albert Heijn, Aldi, Asda, McDonald's, and also others, just to name a few that you might heard of, that rely on us to manage their risk in the food supply chain. Now, obviously, this is now risks which come to food safety, but there's also other risks you might have, and which is like the social risk you might have in the supply chain. No? I just want to quickly tell you that we also have a social risk assessment on that we call a Global Gap add-on, so it adds to the Global Gap certificate, and this helps our members to manage the social risk on the supply chain, and is mainly based on the ILO criteria. And this was collaborations also key, SDG 17 for us. This was developed together with GIZ, I think about 10 years ago, in a German big discount. So this is there at the moment, and near enough 100,000 farmers have gone through it due to the demand of the retailers and supermarkets chains that they want to know a little bit more about the social risk that they might have in the supply chain. So based on this, you can see that the market, also the developed market in Europe, is already pushing there towards it. And then, because Nienke said something also about like, well, you were more talking about landscape use and but also mentioned climate change. I'd like to say and add that we're also currently developing a climate add-on, and we are currently applying for EU funding, and we're developing that together with a facilitator for precision farming and one of the biggest multinational food and beverage companies. And this add-on shall help somehow farmers then to capture CO2 in the soil. No? So this is something that we very much care about as well. And we know that we have this very big outreach already to farmers. We have this large farmer data in our system, and we like to make better use of it even more, no? In a sense that we would like to also do something for the environment and other topics. And I could go on about this. What I'd just like to say as my final point and to finish, because also having seen the slide, you might just think this is super difficult for smallholders. And yes, it is. It's challenging, but it's not impossible. And the example I like to say is, I like this very much. There is in Kenya a big bean producer called Frigoken company, and they actually have 20,000, even more I think nowadays, more than 20,000 certified producers under one certificate. They manage that, and these producers produce beans on 0.1 hectare. So you have 20,000 small farmers producing on 0.1 hectare beans, which are Global Gap certified. And believe me, they are proper certified. We make sure that this is the case. So you can see if you build up a system, you need a support system. Yes, fair enough. But if you build up a system, you can very much manage risking your supply chain also with small farmers, because what they need help with is probably documentation, a little bit maybe also when it comes to pesticides, but the farming practices itself, they're well capable of.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Annika. It was very interesting. We've heard from presenters in previous panels about how COVID-19 crisis has caused them to adjust their procedures. We heard very early on from IFC how they were being called to deliver finance in weeks, not months. Has Global Gap also been coming under some pressure to adjust? And if you have you got any illustrations, small illustrations of just maybe one thing that you've been able to do?
Actually, yeah. Well, I can talk to my from my team. We're doing public trainings on the Global Gap standard, and we just had to shift from face to face in about 1 month or 1.5 months to like an online training now, so that we can still like teach people on how to use the standard and what to make use of it. Same for our CB trainings. But I think the one really to mention is that obviously having the auditor on the field and certifying the farmer is the key of our whole system, and that with all the lockdowns in place was currently very problematic, if not even impossible, and yet we couldn't really have this whole system being postponed to next year or say 6 or 8 months in time, because our members and the supermarkets rely on this to manage their risks. So we're currently very heavily working on a way to do remote auditing, working very much together with our stakeholders to see who would accept that, who wouldn't accept that, and so on and so forth. There will be a possibility to do remote auditing for Global Gap certificates. And I guess that this will also be something that might stay for the future, because obviously at the moment in the whole system, having the auditor being on the field, spending the whole day there is quite expensive and makes sometimes also auditing a bit difficult, because you might need to fly in some certification body because you do not have one in your country. So I can imagine that this will actually also help us in a sense, but also help the producers in the long run, because there's more possibilities for them to get into that system.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you to all the presenters. We're now going to move into an informal discussion. And if you have any questions, please make them to the question marker master on Zoom or through the app in Hoover. I have a question I'd like to ask Delia, and it's actually putting some of the points that we've heard together. Delia, you made it very clear that a lot of food markets that matter a lot are food markets in domestic markets, in countries, and they're not really being traded internationally. How are you seeing national food standards and international food standards coming together so that it's easier for investors, rather than sort of multiple standards and then investors don't know where to go and where to start?
Yeah, so for a start, many national standards, there's been a big emphasis in the last decade, partly with donor money, in kind of modernizing standards. And the way most countries do it is they adapt the standards from rich countries. So for example, we've looked at milk in Kenya over a series of studies, and we find that 95% of milk fails the standards, which are, as I said, similar to international standards. And as we say, if 5% of milk fails the standards, you have a problem with your milk. But if 95% of milk fails the standards, you have a problem with your standards. And what we're trying to promote is not this sort of wholesale adoption of one world, one standards, but a way of kind of working with the informal market. So in a stepwise way, they build their way up until they can meet the standards of the more advanced countries. At the moment, the standards are being used more as a way of harassing and causing problem for the small and medium entrepreneurs, because they cannot meet these standards, and then the authorities often use this as a way to extract money out of them. Over.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Inka, I'd like to turn to you. You really asked us to look at the bigger picture and asked us to do more for not just an individual commodity, which we may be interested in as part of a business, but to look at the holistic system, the landscape, as you call it. We also heard that there's an increased demand for safe food at this moment. Now, clearly, it might be that the current attention goes away, and when the COVID-19 crisis starts to ebb away, the attention on this may go away too. What would you like to say to investors about how they could be the conversion factor? The investors could be the ones that actually keep our attention on these topics and help us to perform better as a global sustainable food system. What do you think?
Thanks, Julian, for that question. Maybe one important word there is resilience. So also for investors towards the future, this COVID-19 has demonstrated that what we need is resilient, or more resilient system that can absorb to the shocks of crises such as COVID. But also many are expecting additional stress situations and emergencies to come out of climate change. So with that, it's in investors' interest as well to support resilience of the food system, and that resilience then requires an emphasis on food safety, but also requires an emphasis on adapting to climate change, and from a social perspective, should also consider inclusivity. So I think this resonates with the point that was made by Delia, and also the point brought up by Anneke. If these food safety requirements become too heavy, they will push out smallholders out of supply chains, because the requirements will become for them too difficult to meet. And that's also, of course, an important consideration when want to make sure that rural livelihoods remain attractive and people can live their lives healthily.
Thank you. Thank you. Nina, maybe you could encourage the audience a little bit. I've had a bit of a sense sitting here that there are a lot of risks out there, and as an investor, I may be thinking, wow, I better go and look at the Global Gap website, then there's the IDH website, and then there's ILRI and Nairobi. There's lots of things I need to learn about now, and it's complicated, and gosh, how can I make this simpler? But I understand that you're really one of the proponents and supporters of responsible investment in agriculture. And so there's clearly something, there's got to be something good in this, something that is supportive. Could you explain a little bit to investors how organizations like DFID and others around the world are encouraging and also supporting the responsible investor in agriculture? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, just to say, as an investor, I would be very interested in looking into this, just because of the risk for business, especially risk around litigation and reputational loss. I mean, it was very clear that there's also a lot of psychology within foodborne diseases or zoonotic diseases that people don't really, consumers don't really distinguish. You know, to mitigate that risk, I think businesses will be more likely to survive a COVID pandemic or future pandemics or similar crises. So I think it's just good business management, really, to manage that risk. DFID does a lot on responsible investment and helping responsible investment. We have a few programs, such as the CASA program, such as other agricultural programs. We work with international organizations on standard setting, for example. So I think all these actions do support investors, leveling the playing field. You know, we work a lot with different types of stakeholders, but equally, of course, if there are any gaps maybe, or any new innovative ideas someone might have in the audience, don't feel shy to raise them. Thank you.
That's good. So please, anybody in the audience who has some ideas, or if you have a question, we have some more minutes, maybe 5-6 more minutes left in this platform. I'd like to ask a question around partnership brokering. I'm not quite sure who to ask though. So if anybody wants to volunteer to come up with an answer, then I'd welcome that, and maybe one or two can answer this. It's pretty clear from what you've all said that the future around safe food and sustainable food systems is not going to be produced by individual effort. It's going to be developed by working together. And I wanted you to talk a little bit, somebody to talk a little bit about the skills and the attributes of brokering partnerships, how to do it. Is it a wizardry area? Is it a new area? Or is it actually something that we all can learn to do? And that can help us to be much better at developing these holistic systems. And it can help financiers to invest in sustainable food systems. Anybody want to give that a go? Annika, please.
Well, I think, first of all, Global Gap, as it is at the moment, is a system of partnership now. So, I mean, yes, we've got our members, they pay a membership fee, but it's a system that we see them as our partners. So you can see that this is a kind of system of partnerships. And we also, and that's what I tried to say with the grass add-on, when I mentioned the social risk add-on, we collaborated there with GIZ, and we did the same, or we did the same for another add-on, which is focusing on the banana pathogen disease. I didn't mention that now, but we did something there collaborating with FAO to develop a protocol to condemn this banana disease that there is currently threatening the banana production, the entire world banana production. And when it comes to collaboration, we are now collaborating with a sustainable rice platform, which is yet another standard setting institute, I think funded by GIZ and other organizations, and ILRI, I think, as well, or ILRI, to support sustainable rice production. So I guess partnering itself isn't that difficult. You need to have just the right mindset, a mindset that works together and having a same goal, and everybody brings in their special expertise to set up a system. Now, so for example, mentioning Sustainable Rice Platform, they had the standard there, but what they lacked was how to manage the certification bodies behind and how to have the data captured. So that's where our expertise then came in. So yeah, I think that's,
okay, thank you.
and we're doing that for others as well.
Thank you. Anybody else want to say something about brokering partnerships and the importance of that area of expertise? Ninka?
Well, maybe I think it's a very important point, Julian, and it's indeed I think a red thread that went through all of the presentations during this webinar. And maybe one important partnership element not to be overlooked is also partnership with NGOs and partnership with academia, who often have more long-term data and another type of insights that can help improve agendas through either science or critical notes.
Thank you very much. So, well, that brings us to the end of the platform today. On behalf of the participants, a big virtual round of applause to all the speakers for sharing their experience, their expertise, and their time. Thank you very much indeed for your contributions. You've helped us to understand that we can have safe and sustainable food systems. And on behalf of the organizers, well done to the participants for all your excellent contributions. Please keep them coming in to the Hoover app, and please take advantage of the networking opportunities there. That app stays alive for another week at least. We'll meet again at the same time next week, and on the platform we will have representatives of Root Capital, Resilience Capital, and the chief economist from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization to discuss future scenarios and the emerging investment opportunities in agribusiness. Not to be missed, I think. Thank you. Look forward to seeing you again.